Games that feature many characters or units are often accompanied by tier lists that seek to grade the characters in terms of various factors, but most often in terms of viability or strength in their respective games. Tier lists are inherently opinionated because if all of the units in a game were created with an obvious hierarchy, then there would hardly be a point in using weaker units, and thus there would hardly be a point in creating tier lists. However, this inherent subjectivity creates many struggles, one of which is bias. In particular, I think something called binary bias affects tier lists most significantly. In essence, binary bias is when people tend to reduce a continuous range of data points into just two categories. For example, in Arknights, you tend to hear things like, this unit is broken or game breaking, or this unit is terrible or unusable, but not much nuance in between. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes a problem when trying to rank 270 plus units on a scale from E- to EX, a 19-point scale. The graded unit must no longer be just good or just bad or even some nebulous space in the middle. There's a certain degree of precision required to grade units in a specific tier, the larger the unit pool becomes. But the larger unit pool becomes, the more tiers that are required to differentiate between units within a tier. And that's because they might have too large a disparity within it, hence the second significant bias. Now, I'm not sure if there's an official name for this, but I'll just call it absolute placement bias. You can think of this bias as not comparing units to their peers when grading. So in tier lists, we often go down the list, place a unit where we feel like they belong, and then move on to the next one with minimal comparison between them. In other words, we give a unit an absolute tier. However, if we start to compare units to each other, some obvious flaws in our tier list might arise. For example, we might notice that two units within a tier are not comparable at all, even if they land roughly in the same tier relative to their strength in the game. So this begs several questions. Is it a bad thing to have many units in one tier and less in others? And the question that I seek to answer with this video, should tier lists be normally distributed? My answer? Yes. But it's complicated. So let me give a brief introduction into what a normal or Gaussian distribution is. So a normal distribution is a distribution of data points that is symmetric about the average. Most people know this as a bell curve. You might be familiar with this from curves in school. In essence, as the number of random data points increases, the closer we get to a normal distribution. The operative word here being random. Obviously, placing units in a tier list is not random because we have information that informs the placement. So why should they be normally distributed? In my opinion, tier lists seek to inform people about the relative strength of certain units compared to others. Imagine we created a tier list with one tier and every unit was in that tier. This doesn't give us much information, so the more precise we can be about which units stand head and shoulders above the rest, and which few units are truly not worth using, we can provide the information that tier lists seek to convey. Now let me preface all the math here by saying that my background is in electrical engineering, not math and certainly not statistics. In this example, I'm going to be using GamePress's Arknights tier list to illustrate my point. This is not an opinion on their placement of individual operators within tiers, but rather a holistic analysis of their approach to creating this tier list. Now this is a particularly good example because there are a sufficient number of units to glean information from, and they provide a comprehensive reason for each unit's placement in the tier list, even if we might not agree with all of them. They also provide a few disclaimers for the tier list, such as it being subjective, the fact that it is purely meta-focused and assumes fully built operators, including full potentials, certain units being better on certain maps than others, as well as the fact that evaluating and re-evaluating the tier list is a complex and slow process. So here's the distribution of all 269 operators and Arknights on the EN server at the time of this writing. There's 270 here because EMEA is counted twice. So right off the bat, we see some interesting things. The A tier has the most operators at 38. There are a few tiers with no operators, and it seems like there are more operators in the higher tiers than the lower tiers. The percentile gives you the percentage of operators below a particular one in the tier list. For example, an S- tier operator is tiered higher than roughly 73% of all operators. Yes, by this metric, Myrtle is better than 73% of the entire Arknights roster. But we can get a bit more information if we put this on a graph. The red curve here is representative of a randomized bell curve. In other words, it's a perfect bell curve. So here we can visually confirm that yes, it seems like the operator rankings tend toward the higher tiers. And we can see that a perfectly random normal distribution would say that there would be 0 operators in EX and E- tiers, and the most operators in the B- tier. And that should make sense since B- is a dead center tier. So the GamePress tier list sucks and we shouldn't listen to it, right? Not quite. You see, Arknights has its own tiering system where the quote-unquote best operators are 6 stars and the next best are 5 stars and so on all the way down to 1 star. So we can reasonably expect the 6-star operators to be in the higher tiers, right? And yes, that's exactly what we see here. Every 6-star operator, barring one, Vigil, is tiered A plus or higher. Not only that, but 6-star operators comprise most of each of the higher tiers as well, making up almost the entirety of the top 3 tiers. We see a similar story with 5-star operators, where they comprise 31 of the 38 operators in the A tier. And as we go down the list of operators by their stars, you can see the curve slowly moving toward lower tiers. Granted, 3, 2, and 1-star operator population is so low that it's almost not worth mentioning. And because there are 71 6 stars, 117 5 stars, 53 4 stars, 17 3 stars, 5 2-stars, and 4 1-star operators, it makes sense that the distribution should be skewed toward higher tiers. I mean, just 6 stars alone represents 71 out of the 269 operators, or about 26% of the population. And if you put 5 and 6-star operators together, they make up almost 70% of the entire population. Of course, we would expect to see more operators in higher tiers, right? Okay, so the GamePress tier list is good then. Again, not quite the whole story. Each of these graphs represent the respective star operators in the context of all the available tiers. But what about how they rank among only the tiers that each star occupies? This is a graph of the 6-star operators if we only considered the tiers which the 6-star operators occupy. So for the 6 stars, they only occupy B plus to EX tiers. Here we can see that the 6 stars still skew high relative to a normal distribution of only 6 stars. Maybe GamePress does overvalue 6 stars. Oh wait, is that Vigil? Much better. So the bell curve looks funny because that's how the math works out with fewer tiers, but at least visually, it looks like it kind of follows a normal distribution curve. It's hard to hold these smaller datasets to intense scrutiny because the smaller the dataset becomes, the lower the fidelity of the information we can glean from it also becomes. But it's interesting to see nonetheless. And again, as we go down the stars, we can see that they at least seem to reasonably follow a normal distribution curve. 4 stars are right on the money, where their average tier, the B tier, has the most operators, and the fringe tiers have the least. So what does this mean? It shows us that among their own stars, operators are distributed somewhat normally. So is this now the whole story? Is GamePress at least reasonable about their distribution of operators? In my opinion, yeah. At least mostly. Like they say, no tier list is perfect. Like I can nitpick operators within certain tiers that, in my opinion, aren't comparable, especially at the middle and lower tiers. For example, Sessa, Snowsaunt, and Sora are in the same B tier as Pudding and Vulcan. Lancet 2, Tsukunogi, and Catapult are in the same C tier as Swire. Or even in higher tiers, they place Liscarm, La Pluma, and even the 4-star J with the likes of Blemishine, Nian, and Scotty. These can all be debatable, and tier lists are inherently limited by the number of available tiers, but we can glean just a bit more interesting information from our good friend percentiles. This is the table with all the operators, what tier they fall into, and their percentile scores. We talked about this earlier in the context of the entire operator population, which you can see on the left, but now we can see operators' strength relative to their peers within a certain star. For example, being just an S- tier as a 6-star places you already at the bottom 15% of all 6 stars, whereas you would measure in the top 27% of all operators, better than 73% of the entire roster. However, being an S- tier as a 4-star, i.e. J and Myrtle, places you among the top 4% of all 4 stars, better than 96% of your peers. So perhaps Arknights was not the ideal example because there are so many variables within the game that it's impossible to compare operators against each other for every single possible scenario. There's different story and event stages, contingency contract, integrated strategies, there's modules and masteries and different classes and roles. However, as much as we love to hate GamePress's Arknights tier list, I think I can say that GamePress did a pretty decent job of creating a comprehensive and well-distributed tier list. So good job, GamePress. And as for the original question, should tier lists be normally distributed? My answer was yes, but it's complicated, and you can see why it's complicated. But you can also see that a somewhat normal distribution creates a clear distinction between adjacent tiers, and even more so among tiers further apart towards the extremes of a tier list. And at the end of the day, that is really all we can expect from a tier list created by humans.